Good afternoon, everybody. Welcome back to your favorite show. Certainly, it's one of our favorite things to do on a Friday afternoon.
Absolutely.
Lovely weather. It stopped raining, so we've been able to, go about our business. And you?
Yeah, I'm enjoying the weather. It's fantastic,
January,
and
you're sober.
And the rain is also fantastic. Like if it's just rained or it's just about to rain, it's great weather for running. And I've been doing a whole bunch of that. It's been absolutely.
And you've been sober. How does it feel?
Yeah. I mean, it's less fun, but it allows me to empathize with you much more than I'm able to do 11 months of the year. Well, why do you look like you just came off a safari?
Well, it's a Friday. It's green, so I just thought I'd blend in. Yeah. But we've got our special guest today, someone who actually knows what they're talking about. Tawi, thank you very much for joining us.
Thanks so
in
much.
The Lion's Den. Are you up for it?
I'm looking forward to it. I don't know what you have as ammunition on this safari, but it'll be fun either way.
Okay.
He looks like he's having the most interesting drink on in the bar today.
Well, he's about to tell us exactly what he's having.
Sure. So just how did I find something that's the best of both worlds for Tinashe and Rufaro? So I was like, in respect of Rufaro's culture, I'll have Savannah Dry. In respect of Tinashe, I'd have the 0.0 version. So this non-alcoholic Savannah Dry. And for me, being able to enjoy the tastes is ideal without having the frustration of having 3 or 4 more hits. Yeah.
Looks like we have a diplomat on shore.
Yes, we do.
Fantastic.
So we've got 2 disagreeable human beings and 1 agreeable one. It'll be fun.
We'll find out who the agreeable one is going to be at the end of the day. Yeah.
And what are we having?
So we're gonna have some peppermint tea. I've been drinking a lot of tea in January, and this is one of my favorites, peppermint flavored. And because it's hot, I'm also gonna have some sparkling water with ice.
Okay, I'll join you.
Yeah, but you're the tea aficionado. Why do they package these things like condoms?
Well, it's the other way around, right?
What do you mean it's the other way around?
What's been around longer, condoms or tea?
Or tea bags? I don't know. I haven't been keeping track. So you reckon the condom marketers are copying the tea people?
Absolutely.
And why are they doing that?
You tell me.
Okay, that's an interesting
Okay,
take.
so maybe to just start off for the benefit of our audience, maybe you can just give us a bit of background, who you are and what you've done.
Sure. I'm Tawanda M Mahere, born and raised in Harare, Zimbabwe. Around the time I was 19, I decided to move to China, which is where I ended up living for 8 years. During that time, I studied Mandarin, studied engineering, got involved in co-founding 2 entrepreneurial ventures, did early stage venture capital, then joined a startup that eventually got acquired by Google, which is where I work now. So I'm currently a product manager at Google within the payments team with a focus on digital identity. And I moved to Silicon Valley, which is where I've been living for the last 6 years, to do my MBA and then work in management consulting and then to join my former colleagues now at Google.
Okay, lots of credentials there. I suppose you really want to put it out there that you know what you're talking about.
Well, that's the journey.
That's okay. But maybe let's start with juxtapositioning life in China and life in America. Give us the differences, give us the similarities, and what that has been for a Zimbabwean guy living both these different, well, we think different, but you've lived through it. Maybe you can speak to that.
Sure. I remember when I moved to the US in 2019 to Palo Alto, California, which is part of Silicon Valley, I remember feeling that I had more culture shock moving to America than I had moved from Zimbabwe to China. And some of the reasons for that were the way that China is actually quite similar to Zimbabwe in many, or just African culture in many cases. The sort of respect for elder people, sort of communal way of building relationships, the way that you do business with trusted people, the way that there's a humility that people bring about. But in the US, what surprised me or was a bit jarring was there's significantly more individualism, which is not necessarily bad. In fact, it enables a lot of the entrepreneurship that we're talking about today. There was so much more of a respect for youth and someone who's got young, energetic thinking and brings that to the fore. There was so much more of a comfort with doing business with someone you have never worked with before, because you know that you've got a strong law enforcement system that's going to support that. And so these were significant differences for me. And so as I've lived in the two, I feel like the United States can be home in the long term.
All right. And which was easier to make friends, China or America?
In fact, I never had that problem. And so both in China and in the US, because even in China, when you see another person who is different, like you're different, be it someone who's a foreigner, it's very easy to like recognize, oh, we're both in this situation. So there was a community of foreigners, be it international students or international entrepreneurs, who I quickly became friends with. And in the US, there were lots of other immigrants who were coming from different corners of the world, all gravitating to Silicon Valley, who, at least when I was doing my MBA, like became a core group of friends. And so making friends hasn't been a huge challenge.
We forget that we actually have a diplomat.
Like, no, but it's just the reality in the sense of what my experience has been. Yeah.
All right.
And you know, philosophically, when you because China's run by the Chinese Communist Party, and it's very command and control, top to bottom economy. The US is a lot more open. It's a lot more chaotic in that respect. In that there isn't that much direction from the top. Is that something that you actually experience when you're on the ground living in China, or it's just something that we read about and it's academic mostly?
There are different facets of the sort of control that the Chinese Communist Party tries to exert on people's lives, but there are also lots of freedoms that you have in China that you don't have in the US.
Really?
So what I mean by that is, in the United States, for example, this might be interesting to you. If you're not above the age of 21, you cannot enter a bar. You cannot drink alcohol legally. In China, there was no such regulation. In the US, you can't drink in public. In China, in China, you can easily walk on the street and be drinking alcohol. There was never that concern. In the US, I'd need to carry around my identity particulars in order to be able to go to places like that. But then in China, you never have that. And so that's the sort of command and control, the freedom that you would want to go and do whatever you want. Whenever I landed in Beijing, I needed within 24 hours or 48 hours to report to a police station to say, hey, this is where I've arrived. I'm a foreigner living at this address. And so there are times when I was absolutely knackered or exhausted after a long flight from Harare back to Beijing. And it took me a few days to get to the police. And they asked me to write an admission of guilt letter acknowledging that. That's the sort of control that the Chinese have. That in the US, no one would even
nobody's interested.
And so these are some examples to you of what people experience. I think something that's a bit more tangible is the way that university places are allocated. In China, you have the Gaokao system, which is a college entrance exam taken by everyone. And based on your results, you're assigned to a school. And so the classmates I had when I was doing college in China were people who had scored in the top 1% of these exams nationwide. Remember, we're talking about a country of 1.3 billion people. And so someone who's been top ends up in this university. In the US, the way that you go to college, you apply to schools that you want. And of course, you would still need to be accepted, but there's significantly more freedom to go after what you want. The last thing that I think comes to mind is...
So sorry, let me get that straight. So you're saying in China, you're actually allocated a university based on your IQ?
Or your performance
your test scores.
Exam.
Your IQ.
Yeah. Or your work ethic also. And what training you've been able to get from your high school teachers.
You can't change. So if they allocate a particular university, you can't change from that university.
It's very, very, very difficult. It's extremely unique. And so it's think of it as the answer is yes. You wouldn't be able to change.
All right. Okay. Yeah. That's very interesting.
Yeah.
And in the US, that's different.
In the US, you can go to college and then decide I don't want to do this anymore and drop out and go to another university, start all over again. That's the sort of freedom.
Okay. So sorry to take you just back from something that you've said already, which I think is very powerful. Because you said from a Zimbabwean perspective, going to China was much easier than going to America. And I would summarize that as the power of narratives, right?
Okay.
That there's a particular narrative that we have of China and there's a particular narrative that we have of America. But you going into the different spaces, there was a difference because now you were actually living in the space, and it didn't live up to what the narrative was. Because ordinarily you think that it's in America that you'll be more comfortable, right?
Or there'll be less of a culture shock.
It's a very valid point. Except the point where I would disagree with you is my forward-looking narrative is one that acknowledges that the United States can be home for me long term, which is not what I think of
before
China.
we get there.
I can't imagine that for China. And that's the narrative's point as well. That's forward-looking.
Okay.
That says that actually, although like there was a bit of a culture shock landing in the United States, very quickly I assimilated and felt very much at home, or found my sort of group and felt at home.
Right. Okay.
And then whereas in China, I absolutely loved the people who I was with, but there was always a limitation in terms of, can this ever be home? In the United States, I'm at home now, and I think that in the long term that will be
what we don't know.
How I think. Yeah.
I think in 20 years' time we'll ask you because maybe you would have moved.
Well,
somewhere else.
I'm willing to bet, but yes, that's a
But
fair
we'll
point.
get to that. Why?
Yeah.
But why I'm asking this question is because we've got a lot of students who just finished their A levels.
Okay.
Right, and some are going to go to America, some are going to go to China, and that's why I was more interested in these narratives. That what's the thing that will shock them the most when they get to China, and what's the thing that will shock them the most when they get to America?
Yeah, the only reason that question is hard to answer is it depends on what narratives you're telling yourself about these guys, or what you've read about these places, what you've been told about them, and like what you believe. Because two people can land in China at the same time and like leave with very different narratives about it. I had experiences where I had like friends who were Zimbabweans who were really not enjoying the experience in China when I was saying I absolutely loved it.
Okay.
I have friends who, when I was saying I was absolutely loving the US, I'm still saying, oh my gosh, this place is awful. And so part of it is really what are you, how are you informing yourself of what the world is like out there? So my encouragement to any A-level students would be read a lot about these countries, be it periodicals. Like I remember reading The Economist. You're like way more of a guru in like macroeconomics than most, but I remember reading The Economist magazine from the time I was like in Form 4. I'm regularly getting a sense. And in fact, the thing that really got me interested in China was watching the Beijing Olympics in 2008, after having read a book about what China was like during the Cultural Revolution, and seeing the stark contrast between the really, really poor China I was reading about and this like successful, wealthy country that's the global stage for the Olympics.
Yep. Mm-hmm.
And that contrast reminded me of what the possibilities of Zimbabwe can be, because 2007, 2008 was a huge economic crisis for us. And so I was thinking about what the future.
How difficult was it to learn Mandarin?
I was fortunate that I'd had the experience of learning foreign languages before. So like we sit here and we're like all bilingual. Shona, English, some people in Dembele as well. And then at school, I'd like learned Latin for 2 years, French for 4 years. And so and I'd really enjoyed those. And so by the time I was studying Mandarin, I'd had that fundamental training. I was also young. I was 19 years old, so my brain was still supple and fresh. But I also had very good teachers.
I find it very difficult to pick up a language. What are your experiences?
Look, I think it's about. I think mindset is a big deal. So already, by saying that you find it difficult to pick up languages, for example, you've got this mental block, right? And so if you had to move to Japan or or Brazil and learn Japanese or Portuguese, you would probably pick it up much slower because you have this mental block already. But if you're But I suspect somebody who's a bit more open-minded, who's excited about the challenge, who has the same IQ as you, would probably pick it up faster because they just look at the mindset that they're approaching it with is
okay. So then let me put you on the spot.
Yeah.
How many languages can you speak?
Only 2. Well, I'm awful too, but it's also I think that when it comes to learning new languages, there's something academic about studying French or Latin at school. As opposed to actually being immersed in that culture. Like if you are living in Shanghai or Beijing and you're learning it, but every day you're interacting with people in that language to the extent that you've got capacity. I think you're much more likely to pick it up and learn it than if it's just a challenge. Like somebody just says, look, how long do you think it'll take you to learn Mandarin in here in Harare? Well, you're not interacting with anybody in Chinese. You're just going through the books. So I think when you're there, when you're immersed in the culture, like George is picking up Swahili simply because he lives in Nairobi.
No, George is actually very, very good with languages.
Yeah, but
point.
Even if he was awful, right? If you spend enough time where people say hi to you in a foreign language, you're gonna pick up. Even if you never learn to actually speak that language, you'll pick up the basics.
Okay.
So I'll tell you what I disagree about there. The point that it's the passive expectation that it will happen if I'm just in the country. I actually think your initial point was way more sensible or practical, actionable, where you said the mindset matters. If your mindset is, I'm going to live in China and I'm going to try to not learn the language, I think the language is hard, even while you're living there, I'm going to hang out with only people who speak the language that I speak, then you won't pick it up. But if you live in Harare and you're like, oh my gosh, I really want to learn Chinese, but I don't have the language environment, you find yourself like being like, I know people who like, I'm going to become a waiter at a Chinese restaurant in Harare so that I'm speaking to the cooks, speaking to my boss, and speaking to clients every day to pick up this language and create that language environment for myself. And I also know people who had lived in China for decades, maybe like 10, 20, 30 years, and were absolutely poor at speaking the language.
Because they didn't want to.
I had no interest in it, is the way that they would say. And they'll say, I live with a wife who speaks my language, or a husband who speaks my language. Like the people around me, all my friends are from my country. Like I don't need to learn this language. And so the mindset point you made earlier is the one that I agree with much more strongly than the expectation that will happen easy. Now, if you do have the right mindset to combine the two, and like you're in the language environment, it's like such a blessing. And that's what I was fortunate enough to benefit from.
Okay, so let's talk about the startup ecosystem in China. So startup ecosystem for dummies, for someone who's sitting in Zimbabwe and has seen the phenomenal rise of entrepreneurs and billionaires. I mean, now China holds the highest number of billionaires in the world.
More than the United States?
Yeah.
Maybe millionaires, not billionaires.
No, the number of billionaires.
I want to challenge that. I don't know what the number is off the top of my head.
No,
but I think it might be million. Yeah, I want to check that number.
Yeah,
I would be very surprised if that's correct. So I'll have to respond in the comments.
China, okay, all right, okay. Doesn't matter, but someone can just comment on the comment section and tell us whether or not China now holds the highest number of billionaires. So the richest people, certainly in America, right? So the richest will be in America, but the number of billionaires, China now has the highest.
Interesting.
Correct me if I'm wrong, please.
I suspect you're wrong, but anyway, carry on.
Okay.
But also the stock market has been a bit challenging on the US for the last few.
Well, last year was a good year.
Last year was a good year, but over the last 5 years.
For tech stocks, it's been a bit up and down.
But what I'm more interested in is, given that background, the Chinese ecosystem, startup ecosystem, and you worked in that space. Could you just give us a brief for dummies?
Sure. So hardware, think of Shenzhen as being the place. So that's just on the border of Hong Kong.
So things like drones and
all your drones, all the hardware that's manufactured. Think of it there. Software, especially consumer software, is like right up in Beijing. So that was like just a mile away from my university and the university cluster. And then if you think about like fintech, Shanghai would be a good place to start. So that's a high level lay of the land. Throughout the country, there are a few like smaller hubs. There are government initiatives that really are trying to encourage more and more entrepreneurs to build up their bases.
So how did it start? What's the history? Ecosystem, were they developed by government? Was it universities? How did it start?
Sure, and because it's an ecosystem, there are multiple contributing factors. But to your point earlier about command and control, there's one of the greatest strengths of the Chinese Communist Party, despite my criticism of them, is there's a very long-term perspective in planning for the country. It's like we're not just planning to win the next election. That's not a concern for us.
Oh, they don't have elections overnight.
We don't need to worry about that. It's a criticism actually of the US, because you're like, okay, I just want to win this next congressional, senate, or presidential election. But in China, they really have planned. And so from around 1978, when there were the reforms and opening up after Chairman Mao died and Deng Xiaoping came in, the market element of just making sure that small businesses can thrive and grow started. But around the late 1990s, what you have is a few examples of entrepreneurs who had been to the United States or been abroad who came back. And so Jack Ma tells this apocryphal story of coming to Silicon Valley, seeing Yahoo, and like trying to type in China beer and not seeing anything where everything else was, and deciding to go back and start a company in Hangzhou, which is in the south.
Well, we can distill what you just said to one word: copy. But
So it's interesting because behind that there is the sort of stereotype about Chinese entrepreneurship that there's a lot of copying. But it made sense. Remember, to Steve Jobs who said that good artists copy, great artists steal.
yeah,
And that's when he had gone into Xerox PARC and like stolen the graphical user interface and brought that to the Macintosh in the early 80s. So to be fair, I wanted to just be like acknowledge that sharing of ideas, which is the way that we would frame it rather than copy, happens
yes, as a
across,
diplomat.
happens all across.
To be fair, there's nothing wrong with copying.
Well, it
In fact,
depends.
that's what developing countries should do.
Except intellectual property rights being respected is a foundational aspect of building up an ecosystem. Otherwise, you screw up the incentives. And like, if the incentives aren't there for me to be able to own what I built, then I won't be able to have it. But yes, so Jack Ma comes back and starts Alibaba. And so in the late 90s, there were a few other companies that started. And after the first bunch of those startups that survived, forget all the ones that failed because you always have that, took off. You had these clusters of big tech companies being formed. And a lot of those people were then able to gain the experience and competence to see what a company, especially a software company that needs to be run, looks like. And at the same time, there was a lot more investment by American companies or international ones to come into China. So you had Microsoft going in there and others. And you have this second generation of entrepreneurs who came out of China, came out of those big tech companies and decided, I want to start my own thing. And so by the time I was there, so 2011 to 2017 is probably the time when I was deeply immersed in the startup ecosystem in Beijing. You had so much confidence among entrepreneurs that I can go out and build something. You had a pool of tech talent coming from the universities, but also having worked in different companies that said, okay, we can actually, as you scale to become a big company, which is the goal in a sense, we actually have that concentration of talent. Then you have the government really prioritizing. We want to make sure that intellectual property rights are respected. We want to make sure that the market needs are being addressed, be it currency or otherwise, and making sure that venture capital investors can get returns on the investment. And so that combination of factors was instrumental to all of this.
I suppose what I'm trying to get at is, was there a master plan, or it was a lot of spontaneous growth?
Both, I would say. The master plan always needs to be there. I found, but it won't show up the way that you think with China
and with tech. That why did they choose tech, and why?
Oh, why did the entrepreneurs themselves choose
get
tech?
into that particular? Because that's one thing where they've done phenomenally well.
It's been really impressive to watch in China, and to in respect of your point around observing and learning from others. I think the examples in the United States of like seeing companies like Yahoo take off, like really inspired this generation of entrepreneurs. And so going into tech was great. But I guess the implicit in your question was acknowledgement that there are so many other industries where small businesses have thrived in China. And so even as we think about sort of what China's growth overall has been, tech has been a big part of it, but there's so many other industries. If you think about the infrastructure that's been there, that's been built up, it's like never a
so
question
it wasn't
around
tech specific, it was, okay, let's
the entire economy has been growing at like 8 to 10% for like decades was the case until then. And so being able to have...
But wasn't that mostly just them picking low-hanging fruit?
But I mean, how many decades can you have?
Labor, manufacturing.
That's early on, but now, by 2008, it can't just be labor. It has to be specific industries.
These are conversations that we have in the United States right now. Tim Cook, the CEO of Apple, is often asked, why are we not building iPhones in the United States? We want to create these jobs. Is it just because we're in China and is it just because in China we get low cost labor? And he said, it's not about labor being cheap in China. That's not the issue anymore. In the
The industrial base just isn't there in the US. They just couldn't do it if they wanted to.
We wouldn't be able to do that because it's the concentration of the technical expertise that you have for the electronic supply chain and semiconductor supply chain in Shenzhen and the surrounding parts of China there that you just aren't able to replicate. It's not like something that's built up overnight. And so this is what becomes a bit challenging about the master plan, because you have the centralized authority that says, okay, these are the 5 steps, go out and do it. But like innovation doesn't work that way. There needs to be not just the top down, but also the bottoms up. And you need to allow that, Mr. Libertarian. You want the entrepreneurs to have control over their own destiny, and those are the people who would have
and to be fair to Tim Cook and the American businesses that do a lot of their manufacturing in China, they actually built that industrial base. They literally, the McKinseys and Boston Consultant groups of this world in the late 70s, early 80s said, look, guys, it doesn't make sense to be building these things here in the US. There are all these advantages doing it in China. And, if you look at any Apple product, it literally says on the back, designed in California, made in China. So, all of those Foxconn factories in Shenzhen making iPhones, there's a guy from California who goes and says, right, guys, this is, what you need to do. So it's just, the base is in China, but it's actually the ideation. It's the brainchild of folks in the West.
True.
I think that story around the outsourcing that was encouraged throughout the 80s and 90s is very, very true. The point around how Apple took advantage of those differentials of just like global opportunities in terms of like where there's concentration of labor to say, okay, we're going to have engineers. There would be like like planes full of like Apple engineers who would fly from San Francisco to Shanghai on a daily basis. Just like many people who just go in there and then they'll spend several weeks there. And so the point around innovation and creativity is something where the United States is unparalleled in being able to unleash the creative potential of
We'll
people.
get to the US.
Yeah, sure.
Let's just stick with China for a moment. And there's something that I'm curious about, and I want you to speak to, because we're running a thread from the first question to the second question.
Okay.
So you've got the Chinese Communist Party. That's very commandist, if you think about it. It's a command sort of structure, no elections. Then you've got this ecosystem, and the way you're describing it, it's quite phenomenal. I mean, it rivals America, right? It's quite phenomenal, and you've got lots of people who succeeded in that. But my question has to do with regulation. How does the Chinese government manage regulation? Because it looks like there is enough room for entrepreneurs to thrive and less regulation, right? Because if it was highly regulated, then they wouldn't thrive. Or am I wrong?
There was a significant change in the way that the Chinese Communist Party approaches big business around 2019-20. I remember there was a time when Jack Ma... 2019.
Okay,
2019, 2020.
Yeah.
Around about the time Jack Ma disappeared.
And when Jack Ma disappeared was like a noticeable turning point. And I had several friends who were still in Beijing because I had moved to the US who said, we're leaving now. Because the party was significantly more heavy-handed in its engagement with tech entrepreneurs. In a sense, there was significantly more power that was coming with all the wealth that was being created. And so there was a desire to come in and control a bit more. And so my impression, and I can tell you a bit more about the time that I was there, but looking from the back, from a distance right now, it seems that regulation is significantly more stringent than it was then. And so that had lots of pros and cons. The pros being obviously that when there was limited regulation, you could have these thousands of flowers blooming of people coming up with different ideas or starting new things. And what's impressive about China, among all these other things we mentioned, is you've got this huge pool of hardworking, really, really smart, technically trained people. So when there is an idea, the execution pace is very, very fast, and people are able to do that. And so regulators would slow that down in many cases. And so when there was limited regulation, it was a bit easier to start up these companies. But the downside was obviously that there was a lot more of these fake or counterfeit, lower quality goods. And that's not just true of tech, it's true of many other products.
Well, that's how Japan, for example, that's how we started, right?
And this is the journey over time. That's been my experience.
Okay, so last question on China. What could Africa learn, or what could Zimbabwe learn? So suppose you were given a blank check or a blank piece of paper, and you had to design and to think about, or maybe it's the ideation to think about or design a master plan. What could Zimbabwe
with the result being what
China
Are you doing just the overall macroeconomic event?
No,
or
no,
like
just
tech?
ecosystem, just purely on a startup ecosystem. What could a new country as Zimbabwe do differently?
So for Zimbabwe, there's so many leaps that we would need to make, because like, how do you make Zimbabwe more competitive for startup business compared to other African countries?
Yeah, speak to that.
And then other compared to developed countries, and then compared to the US, and then compared to Silicon Valley, because in a sense, Silicon Valley is like got a lot of advantages over each one of these other groups, and people around the world who look at China and its startup ecosystem also think about that. One is making sure that we get the fundamentals right for our macroeconomic growth. If the economy, if our currency is unstable and our inflation rate is as high as it is, and if we've got limited electricity and no infrastructural development, if we've got low digital penetration because like not everyone's able to afford a mobile phone, there's just so much less that you can even start talking about for someone who's trying to build a consumer tech ecosystem. When you talk about an African country, what's a bit more difficult about that is China had a mass consumer base of 1.6 billion people, or like 1.3 billion. In Africa, when you're starting a business in Zimbabwe or any African country, you don't automatically have access to that entire part.
Yeah.
Like, this was such a fragmented continent economically, that expansion from one country to another. And I experienced this as an operator working for a startup and trying to expand us across the continent. That you start out in South Africa, but getting into Botswana, Zimbabwe, and Namibia is so much harder. And if we think about the real benefits of software as an industry, it's true in China, it's true anywhere else. It's like being able to have a zero marginal cost product, where you're like, okay, I'm able to charge you more and more, but how much it costs me is the same. But to make one piece of software, one website, and then every additional customer who's coming in pays me more, but doesn't cost me more or much more. And in a sense, we need to figure out as Africa how we
Why
trade
would
more.
that be a problem with tech? Because the idea is if you come up with, and you're working on payments, if you come up with a payment structure, it supersedes the jurisdictions, the borders.
It
that
really
we
should,
have.
but then there are some. So this is where, as Africa, we continue to have these limitations, because you don't. If you have to start a software company today in Zimbabwe, distribution across everyone, particularly marketing, getting people to know and pay for your product, is insanely harder for all the other countries on the continent. And so there does need, at least I would think that African leaders, from a policy perspective, need to do much more pragmatic thinking about intra-African trade. And this is not just true of software and tech, it's true of even sort of physical goods. Because then you know that, okay, I'm building this thing and I've got access.
But we know it's never going to happen. So
No, we don't know that it's never
No, we
going to
don't.
happen. That's incredibly
not in our
pessimistic.
lifetime.
No, I think it will happen in our lifetime. It's just that the current crop of leadership we have is very pedestrian and provincial in the outlook, because there is no reason, and we've had this discussion many times. If you think about Africa, there's about 1.3 billion of us, right? There's 50 plus nation states with borders and different tax and customs regulations. We've got 40 plus different currencies. So it's a nightmare to do. If you build something in Zimbabwe and want to replicate that business across Africa, it's a train smash, right? Whereas, if you build a product in Shanghai, you've got access to 1.6 billion people. If you build a product anywhere in the EU, whether it's in Berlin or Lisbon, you've got access to that entire market. So unfortunately, we've got this,
But Rivera, I still differ, because if you think about it, this is a question for you both. It's starting a Facebook. You don't need different jurisdictions in Africa.
No, but turning it into a huge Facebook does require, turning it into a huge business does require you to have access to those markets.
Let's take payments, for example, right?
But the idea could be from Zim, and then you take it to America, for example, or you take it to the EU, or you take it to China. It doesn't have to be for Africa.
So if you're talking about, so then that's no longer an African business then. If you're like, okay, because then Tawanda has to leave Zimbabwe to go to America to build this business at that scale. But if we're talking about how we build the master plan for African businesses, we need to make sure that we figure out these policy hurdles. And a big one, even when you talk about Shanghai, is immigration. Like, imagine if you wanted to get the top 1% of software engineers in Africa even. We don't even want to talk about the rest of the world. where would you be able to bring them all to Harare? If you have there'll be some guys in Nigeria, some guys in like Kenya, some guys maybe in Cape Town. Would you be able to bring them all to Harare? Would you be able to get all of them to come to Cape Town
They can work
and live there?
Off-site?
And so this is the problem where it's like everyone has to either work online to build up these startup communities, which today is much easier than it was a decade ago. But it's still something that we need to address as Africans. Can we allow there to be concentrated hubs of tech talent? Right now, Lagos, Nairobi, Cape Town, to your point, are hubs that exist. But we need to make it easier for people to move across borders and to be able to work there without feeling like, oh, they're taking away our jobs. And so like a bit more of this nationalistic sort of thinking is limited. So we need to address that.
Yeah, I just want to double down on something that he said earlier, because I don't think that people, understand it fully. Because if you think about all of these great companies that were built by founder entrepreneurs, your Apples, your Microsoft, that sort of thing, right? And this is a feature of startups that become great companies. Okay, if you read about the early days of Amazon, of Microsoft, Facebook, you have these founder entrepreneurs working incredibly hard, like 16, 18 hours a day, right? 7 days a week, sleeping in the office. And what I promise you, none of those guys were grappling with in those 16, 18 hour days is, what am I going to do about power?
Yeah.
Right. Oh, what's the US Zim dollar exchange rate? I need some Zim dollars to pay with the utility. How do I figure that out? They're hyper focused on building the product, on building the business. They're not distracted by all these other issues, which they would be if they were based in Harare. And so that's why it's important, like these currency issues, these macro issues, they seem distant and academic at some level, like the macroeconomic, and we're talking about a startup, which is a very micro focused conversation. But there's no way you're going to get a guy working 18 hours a day, hyper focused on building an amazing product, if he or she has to grapple with all these other issues.
Fully agree with that. When you talk about work ethic, I think this was something that hit me hard in China and impressed me. There's this phrase in Chinese tech culture, 996, 996, which means 9 a.m. to 9 p.m. 6 days a week. If you're joining a startup in China, those are the expected working hours. And this is what I experienced. I remember like several times, like staying at the office until 12 midnight, 1 a.m., 2 a.m. And it wasn't surprising to anyone because this was the expectation, especially if you're trying to get ahead. And the thinking is that China itself is hyper competitive internally. And so people have that work ethic where they really, really want to work super hard. They obviously trade those things just in terms of how productive people are, but that's something that we need to address. And so what's our attitude?
So what is the labor environment like in terms of the rules? Do they have at will employment? Do you, like, if you need to let someone go, do you have to jump through hoops?
That's a great point. I remember being shocked about this when I visited Berlin, where they were like, "Oh, people aren't even allowed to work beyond certain hours, even if they want to, within the tech startup culture." And in China, this was one of the key market reforms that happened, where it's like, okay, at will employment. And in fact, if I'm to be working for you, Tinashe, and then I want to go and work for Rufaro needs to get a letter releasing me from you. And this is the way that the parties enabled it. So it's so pro-business in a sense, that you as an employee need to make sure that, it's very much at will employment, and you need to make sure that you've like kept things in good standing with this
fantastic.
employee. Yeah, well, it's great for you as a business person because you're saying, okay, fine, I can hire people, and then you end up with super low unemployment rates because there's just so many opportunities being created. And obviously, you need then the financial aspect where venture capital investors know that, okay, we can put money into this thing. 90% of the startups are going to fail, but the ones that do succeed are going to be huge.
Well, that's always going to be very difficult in Africa because our labor laws, that's not going to change.
We must just get rid of them.
We have communists in government, and look at what's happening in South Africa. You have 18 million people on grants.
It's actually something that we don't spend enough time talking about as we talk about these master plans. So it's some cultural elements where if I'm to be your boss, Tinashe, and I'm making you work 18 hours a day, how quickly will it be for people around to say you're being taken advantage of, Tinashe? Someone's like abusing or harassing you, especially if the startup doesn't succeed. And it's like, okay, you are just being made to work hard. You should stand up for yourself. And part of it is we've just had this history of so much oppression.
Well, in Africa, you even have to pay retrenchment.
So
that makes it uncompetitive compared to even China.
Yeah.
Okay. Thanks for that. Now we need to go to Silicon Valley, and I want to start with something that's quite interesting, which is myth and myth making. This idea of the American dream, this idea of Silicon Valley, what is real and what is not.
I would say the definition, and again, your point around narratives becomes relevant, because how are we defining the American dream? If it's for at a high level, it's like many people think of it as you can make anything of yourself if you work hard, based on your talent, drive, and ambition. And it's far less important, like who your parents were, where you started out in life, or other sort of any form of
your race, gender, sexuality.
Well, this was what I was going to say, except this now is becoming something that's a topical question. It's like, oh, okay, this is the reason. And so the idea that I could grow up in many immigrants who end up in the US and start companies with the ambition to become wealthy are really believing in the American dream. And so if you look at the people who are the wealthiest in the United States, the list of billionaires, we're talking about billionaires early on, the list is dominated by people who started something innovative that they built from scratch. And when I say from scratch, it's not that they didn't have advantages of any sort, but they built something, be it like all these tech entrepreneurs since that's...
It's tangible. People can see them. They know.
Yeah. And so this is actually a criticism that many European friends of mine make about the culture in Europe, where if you look at the richest people there, many of them inherited wealth that's been there for a long time. And so the American dream, in many cases, particularly when you think about California, is far more about people coming from different parts of the country being like, I really have a dream and I really think I can make it and I want to be able to do it. And so the optimist in me still thinks that it can be true. Mindset again, if your mindset is you want to enable it, discrimination will always be true. And it's something that we need to address. But if someone wants to build something for themselves... What makes
Silicon Valley special, in your view, if you think about it?
I think there's several aspects. One is it's just the idea that you'd be able, and the reality that you're able to show up here, have some vision of what you want the world to be like, and be able to take a risk with very little fear and courageously go after it. And if you want to be able to do it, you can do it. And so the concentration of tech talent that exists with the universities that are there, Stanford, UC Berkeley, and so on. Number two, sort of the culture of allowing that risk-taking and accepting failure and saying, okay, well, you failed in your first startup, that's all right, we're going to fund you again. Number three, the abundance of wealthy people who are willing to invest in startups like this because they know that the returns, if they get the one right, are going to be astronomical. And sort of this culture of sharing ideas and really helping people. I think it's one thing that's like really well known for people who've lived in Silicon Valley, that like if you've gone off and started a business and I come to you and ask for help, in many cases, you'll be willing to help me. And you're like, yeah, Tawanda, like, I know what it was like when I was in the trenches. There's much less, I want to be careful about using this word tribalism there, where it's like, oh, okay, well, I don't want him to succeed, but I just want to help my own people. And I'm careful about it because there are some clusters of people who are like, okay, fine, I help people who are similar to me in this regard, in that regard. But I think those are some of the ingredients that make it particularly special. And this happens generation over generation.
Yeah, that's what I was going to get to that. How much of it is the Californian culture? So if you think about California, that was where the gold rush happened, right?
Yeah.
So you're thinking about, my great-grandfather would have been part of the El Dorado rush, and they would have made money then, or oil, or whatever it is. But that gene is within that particular geographical space.
100%.
So, fourth, fifth generation, but there's this gene that's within the system that says, you know what, you can be anything and you can do whatever you want. How much of it is the Californian culture, and how much of it is now the Silicon tech culture?
I actually think you hit the nail on the head. It's the way that even within the United States, California holds this special place, and it's true on both coasts, of being this place for opportunity. And this is the parallel that you see with like Hollywood and Silicon Valley, as you pointed out to me. If you have, like, even during the gold rush, people would come from all parts of the country and different parts of the world saying, I'm going to make a fortune in California. And so it resulted in more and more of the culture of saying, hey, you just come here and you can try something out. And in many cases, it won't work out. in most cases it won't work out, but try again, and we respect that. And so the third, fourth generation that you talk about is very, very true. And in many cases, it's not like your descendants directly, but people who have seen what you've done and are inspired by it. And so even if you have to come to San Francisco, it's such an itinerant community of a lot of people who are not born and raised in San Francisco, but came there. And as a result, you have this
plug into the culture.
To plug
So
into
it's a
that.
melting pot.
It ends up being a melting pot of like highly ambitious, really, really smart, driven people who want to be part of that, and be it working in the big tech companies in some role, or being able to like start something of their own. I mean, I think that's something that's like particularly.
So after listening to him, one is persuaded to think that maybe it's the idea that matters and not capital that matters.
No, but
That's why
it's definitely not capital in this instance, because if you think about Shanghai, Beijing, or London, Tel Aviv, whatever, these places don't have a shortage of capital. So I don't think capital is the differentiator. I think it's a prerequisite, but I don't think it's like the magic sauce.
Well, I was going to make, I think it's still the magic sauce. So I think you did a very good job of, giving us this idea of the culture and ideas and what actually happens within the system. But I still think that capital plays a big role. And I'll tell you why. Because when you look at Silicon Valley, why are people moving from Africa? Why are people moving from India and ending up in this melting pot? Is it the culture or is it the capital?
I think both are really important. The capital point is really huge. Paul Graham, the founder of Y Combinator, the big startup accelerator that's produced several unicorns, says that in order to, he regularly gets the question from policymakers or entrepreneurs around the world, how do we build our own Silicon Valley here? And so what he says, you need two things. You need rich people and nerds. And the nerds is like all the talent that I'm talking about that's like there from the universities and from all the big tech companies that have been there generation after generation. But then the rich people are the ones who are going to be like, Tawanda, I'll throw a few $100,000 into the startup that you have. And I know it's probably going to fail, but I'm willing to fund it. And so California, because of the weather and because of the just how comfortable a place it is to live, attracts people who are rich, who are willing to be there and be venture capital investors. But it's not just their money that's helpful, but it's also the mentorship they're able to provide. Because they're like, I've been through I've been in the trenches and I've experienced it. And that's the cultural aspect, because you asked capital and culture. Mm-hmm. Being able to say, I've experienced this, I'll mentor you, I'll advise you on this. And so coming back to your Africa point, one of the things that I've heard multiple times from venture capital investors about the challenges of investing in Africa, they're like, where's the pool of entrepreneurs going to come from? Like, what's the first generation that's now of like tech companies that are existing right now, be it big ones, who are going to now spawn the second generation of people going to peel away and say, excuse me, I've seen something grow from 0 to 100 and I'm now going to go out and start my own thing from 0. And because we don't have enough of a critical mass, in a sense, of those sort of companies, it's really, really hard. And so both the capital and the culture are really, really important. It's also important to remember, like, California's economy is like $3 trillion. And like in Zimbabwe, our economy is what GDP is like 30.
I think California is now closer to 5 trillion.
Let's not mention California and Zimbabwe in the same breath.
Okay, yeah.
but I'm going to push back. I'm going to push back quite strongly on this capital argument, because if you look at China as a country,
can I please have some water?
They're sitting on trillions of dollars in foreign reserves and savings, and they also, if it was up to them, Silicon Valley would be somewhere in China, right? China would be known as the world's innovation capital, and it wouldn't be Silicon Valley. So the challenge isn't that they don't have capital to deploy, and they don't have the desire to have an amazing take up, right? And again, if you look at China, it's got a population of 1.4 billion. There are more Chinese people graduating with STEM degrees than all of Europe and the US combined, right? So they don't have a challenge with capital. They don't have a challenge in terms of educated people to deploy in a startup hub. So why isn't the world's foremost startup hub in China? And in my opinion, I think the reason why it's in Silicon Valley and not somewhere in China, it's because of the culture. And one of the differences between California and China in terms of culture is that because of the command control setup in China, you're not allowed to say certain things, right, that are politically incorrect in China. And I think part of the nature of an entrepreneur, of that risk-taking mindset, is a rebelliousness. It's a guy who looks at the way things are done and says, no. There's a new, better way we can do things that's going to change the world. So this is there's something in the nature of an entrepreneur that's rebellious, that won't do well in a place like China, where if you express a political opinion, you can end up in jail.
Let me follow through with a question, and I want you to answer this. Whatever China did, they did it very well because it got them to this far, which is the second largest economy in the world. So whatever they did, whatever was in the water, worked. The sort of criticism I hear from you is taking you from being the second largest economy to becoming the first. And
I'm not talking about economic size. I'm talking about like innovation, being premier in innovation.
They were innovative,
yeah,
right? And it got them this far.
Yeah,
they were. Would you agree?
I don't think they were innovative. I think that they were disciplined and they were conscientious. And I don't think they were innovative.
They were. Otherwise, they wouldn't get this far.
So I like to look at the data, right? So
okay, what's innovation?
So innovation is basically building something new that wasn't there before, right? No. In terms of
that's invention. That's not innovation.
Okay.
Okay. So let's.
I agree with you. I agree with you that capital is necessary but not sufficient. But the point around China that I would disagree with is the political sensitivity, because most entrepreneurs don't want to spend their time talking about political issues. What they want to be able to say, to have contrarian takes on, is some pieces about an industry and some market. And so China doesn't like, at least until the last few years, there wasn't as much of even interest in controlling people's perspective around that. And so there's this unspoken sort of understanding between the Chinese government and the people, which is we'll allow the economy to continue to grow, even if we restrict your democratic freedoms. Yeah, I need to hydrate. But I think that's a key thing to keep in mind. Most entrepreneurs aren't trying to be out there talking about politics, but they want to have contrarian takes there. Yeah. I'm curious, but I do actually think there's a lot of innovation happening in China even right now. We look at AI, we look at some of these e-commerce companies that are taking off. TikTok, remember, was a company that had its roots in a company started in China called Douyin, which was basically TikTok there. And so it eventually started by ByteDance, which was the overall holding company, then moved to the US, acquired a company called Music.ly, and then took off as TikTok. That's innovation.
Can we get a glass?
Yeah, sure.
If I die on set, maybe you're right, the lions will get me.
They will. Let's just get a glass for you.
Okay, there you go. Okay, this will be good. Or a napkin as well, if you guys have any serviettes.
Okay, can we get a napkin? Wheezy?
Yeah, he'll get a napkin. So, look.
You've had time to think about this.
Yeah.
Let's hear your rebuttal.
I hear him, but I still think there's a cultural element to it where, Silicon Valley, it doesn't matter what you look like, what your accent is, which university you did or didn't go to. They're much more accepting of weird, rebellious, nerdy talent, whereas China is much more conformist. So, and I think you actually spoke to this a little bit earlier when you spoke about 2019 or 2020, around about the time Jack Ma disappeared, that a lot of folks who were highly talented, who were building things, decided, you know what, that's my cue to get out of here, right? Because there's this, and I'm not making the case that successful entrepreneurs like to wade into politics, but I think that their nature's just to be rebellious and to be less politically correct, and they're just not going to be as comfortable in a place like Beijing or Shanghai as they would be in a San Francisco.
You followed the space in Tel Aviv. Would you say that's the same? Because certainly from you're not going to find that much variety in terms of people and where
No,
they're
no. So
coming from.
Tel Aviv,
In Tel Aviv, and Tel Aviv has succeeded to a great extent.
So Tel Aviv
it's not about-
is actually a melting pot, because if you look at the
but it negates your point. That's
what
Tel Aviv has succeeded,
Yes.
despite not having the culture that's in Silicon Valley.
No,
in terms
I'm saying that
diversity.
so they don't have as much diversity as a Silicon Valley, but they do have that culture, because if you look at the crowd in Tel Aviv, especially if it's people who migrated to Israel from other parts of the world, exercising their right of return, they're from all over the world, right? You've got Ethiopians, you've got Russians, you've got East Europeans and West Europeans, all living in Tel Aviv, different cultures, different languages, different backgrounds. And so you have, and they have this acceptance of, we actually don't care where you come from, what you look like, what language you speak, right? What matters, what is foremost is, what's your contribution? What's your idea? Let's experiment with it. Let's run with it.
I strongly agree with you. So I spent some time in Israel with some business school classmates, and I've also looked at the startup nation like Israel, because Israel is famous.
It's considered to be a startup nation. Yeah.
Incredible in this regard. I strongly agree with you on the point around willingness to challenge authority. And so there's a lot of research that's been done in Jewish culture, in the way that even kids speak to their parents and are willing to challenge them or question them on a lot of why they do things. And I think that aspect of being willing to speak truth to power,
you know what
is very
Israel
important.
means? The literal translation of what Israel is, it's he who struggles with God.
Mm-hmm.
So it's about challenging
Yeah.
God. Actually, that's what Israel means. It's he who struggles with God. So I think where they're birthed, that's been part of their culture.
Yeah.
Well, it is literally, like, if you look at their national history, it is a startup nation. It's one of the few nations where it actually started as an idea from a guy, the founder of Zionism was born in Poland, he invented this idea that actually we have a homeland over there and we should organize ourselves to go and take over. So it is literally a startup nation, and that's the ethos of.
One could say the very same about Zimbabwe in 1890.
Yes, except that court that was running the country got
no longer
kicked out in 1980.
Wait, surely you're not suggesting. I just have to make sure, because I'll be asked about sitting around with this. Surely you're not suggesting that if things had gone differently in the late 70s and 1980, Zimbabwe would still be a more of a startup nation. That's not what you're suggesting.
No. I'm not suggesting that. But what I'm saying is,
what are you saying?
But I'm just speaking to the actual historical fact of the matter, right? The reason why we're here, sitting on at this bar, speaking in English, is because we were colonized by the British, not the French or Portuguese or Spanish, right? We went to schools and we were taught in English, and some of our cultural habits are from the Brits, right? Because of this history. And they literally came to this part of the world in 1890, and we were Iron Age farmers, and they reshaped it, right? And they said, look, they didn't do it for our benefit, right? And it wasn't a benevolent exercise, but they basically built the modern state that we call Zimbabwe.
I think I would love to have a conversation about the direction that this went, because I strongly push back against thinking about the truly unfortunate, tragic history of colonialism as being one that turned out to be beneficial in the big picture to the development of our overall national psyche. And there was so much suffering and death, so much loss of life by Black African Zimbabwean people as a result of that could never be washed away. And so,
But wasn't that already happening pre-1890?
So, but it doesn't justify it happening.
No. You see,
if you're like, oh, it happened before.
I think.
I know we're drifting into politics, but this is something.
That's fine. Well, it's not really. It's history.
It is
It's
part of
history,
history.
right?
Yeah.
You see, I think where I wouldn't call it a mistake, or I think where we view history differently is, we can take a moralistic perspective, right? And we can say, oh my gosh, how awful was it that these guys came?
It is
and
true. It is awful.
They abused us and this, right? And that's a valid take. I'm not going to take that away from you. But I tend to look at history dispassionately, right? People have been, throughout human civilization, conquest, conquering are part of history.
The last 6,000 years,
right?
That's just conquest and conquering.
So
what it is.
What do you say to the families of those people whose parents died, whose parents were murdered, killed, raped, whose grandparents went through that? If you say the benefit is that now the three of us can drink tea, peppermint tea.
So you know what they say? I think.
Can I just answer this one?
Yeah, sure.
Is your problem that it was the white man who did the plunder?
I don't think
Because
there's
it could
any.
very well have been a black man or a Chinese.
I'm not in any support of any rationalization of the benefits of such a brutal, torturous process. Particularly when we continue to see so much suffering.
Okay, no. So I've got the perfect response to that take. So it's kind of like the opposite of, if you think about warfare, right? War is horrible, okay? And they have an expression that they use in war called collateral damage, right? So you are trying to attack, an enemy combatant, and then you inadvertently hurt an innocent, right? And they call that collateral damage, and it's awful, yeah? And I think in history, right, if you zoom out and you think about it at a very high level, right, when awful things are done deliberately, right, like imperial colonialism, there are actually collateral benefits, okay? So.
But the end never justifies.
Roman, Greek.
No, but the end doesn't justify the means. And
I'm not saying that because they're collateral benefits, the imperial colonialism is fantastic or it's okay. I'm not saying that. I'm just saying we would be deluding ourselves if we say that everything about imperial colonialism is awful and there were no collateral benefits. That's just a lie.
This is a raging debate topic in the United States right now, particularly in Florida, where there are teachers who are educating students that slavery was helpful to the slaves because they learned skills from their masters. This is in textbooks today. This is the danger of starting to create a narrative that, it wasn't that bad, because in the future we end up justifying like future atrocities by saying, in the past there were benefits that came along. Morally, it's never acceptable to oppress people, torture people, rape, murder, pillage in the way that was done. Whether or not it's been done for warfare in other human affairs of the last several millennia may be true, but it doesn't ever justify it. And the conversation of benefits becomes dangerous because of this. Because
for people who don't understand nuance.
Because you end up, people say the same thing about Mugabe now. Mugabe was terrible, but what are we talking about? Why are we even having this conversation? Emerson Mnangagwa was like a terrible, but no, we don't want to even, I'm not saying, when things are extreme and people, especially when it comes to unjust loss of life, raping, murdering, pillaging, at this level we have to be extra careful. Just like human rights abuses, which is exactly what.
So Terry, you're a guest, and we're going to give you the last word. So thank you very much for that word.
Oh, you're chasing me out because I have political views against colonialism.
No, because the producer is jumping up and down.
We've done an hour. It's so much fun.
Done. But what we need to do is to do the rabbit hole.
Sounds good.
So that we can then carry on this conversation, because there's a lot that we actually haven't covered.
Sounds great.
And we need to cover.
Sounds great.
So we're just going to break, and we'll do a second episode. To the viewers at home, I hope you found this as riveting as I did. This was very, very, very illuminating. And thank you very much for coming.
Thanks so much.
Yeah,
I'm
you
glad
can
I
hold
didn't
your
start.
own. You can have your own.
I'm glad I didn't start crying at that last part because it would have been difficult to be able to explain. Guys, I was just thirsty. Thanks so much for having me. This is great.
Fantastic. To everybody at home, thank you very much. Enjoy your weekend and join us for the rabbit hole. This has been interesting. Thank you. Please continue to like, share, and subscribe. And don't forget to comment. Otherwise, have yourself a wonderful weekend. Cheers.